Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel on After Munich, What? The Future of the Post-World War II Order. Tremendous team of panelists on my left. Leslie Vinjamuri, Director for the US and Americas Program at Chatham House, and a Professor of International Relations at SOAS in London. Stefan Mair, Executive Board Director of the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. To his left, Prof. de Wijk, founder of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies and a professor of international relations at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And furthest to my left, or to your right, Ian Lesser, distinguished fellow and advisor to the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, based in Brussels. Well, we've had 10 weeks that shook the world. And in these 10 weeks, we have seen things that I think many of us didn't expect to see and certainly hoped never to see. And that's what we're here to discuss today. The return of extreme nationalism and expansionism in the United States, with claims on European Union member states, Greenland from Denmark, claims on Panama, claims on Canada, a NATO ally. The return of US protectionism for the first time since the 1930s. Tariffs on all, except for Russia, of course. And talking of that, the quest for a quick US rapprochement with Russia over the heads and the interests of Ukraine and of the Europeans, and risking perhaps emboldening Vladimir Putin in Europe. The demand that Europe spend 5% of its GDP on arms, and of course buy them from the United States, along with LNG, while all the time calling into question NATO's mutual defense clause and imposing punitive tariffs on our European allies. And of course, and that's what the Munich in this title is about, not the Munich of 1938, but the Munich of 2025, the denigration of European values and the demand for freedom of hate speech, if I could put it that way. Well, it's been a roller coaster ride, and the weathermen say there's more to come. To analyze that, my name, by the way, I failed to introduce myself. I'm just Paul Taylor. I'm your chairman today, and I'm a senior visiting fellow with the European Policy Centre and a part-time columnist for The Guardian. Rob, let me start, if I may, with you. Are we in a new global Cold War now? And if we are, what are the risks of hot wars? And what does the military balance look like in Europe and in Asia?
Well, thank you very much. In a way, yes, we seem to be in a new global Cold War, and that is because of the huge geopolitical shifts that are visible for quite a while now. This is nothing new. In my view, the Trump administration is just an accelerator for change. Because we see for many, many years that the world is changing. And that is, of course, because of the rise of China. The world is becoming less democratic, more mercantilist, more transactional, and less rules-based. We know that for years and years, and we in Europe did nothing. We ignored the problem. If I'm not mistaken, we move into a world which is almost a 19th century world of spheres of influence and buffer zones. That's completely different from what we knew until, let's say, a couple of months ago. This is exactly what the US wants and what Russia wants. But in a way, this is also what China wants. Now, the big problem for us Europeans is, of course, our dependency on the US. We are very dependent on American tech companies, which is really a big problem because we are also in the midst of the fourth industrial data revolution. For example, if you talk if you discuss military issues here, then there is of course a huge problem for F-16s or F-35 aircraft, because they are dependent on the data links running through American computers. So there is indeed a kind of kill switch here, where the Americans can stop us from using those aircraft. But even more problematic is that the Americans fulfill three essential roles within NATO. First of all, it's a force integrator. That's the most important one. That is something we do not have. Only the US has the capabilities to command the fragmented European forces and use them and transform them into one big fighting force. We can't do that. We missed the command and control systems for that. It's also the Americans, a provider of long-range weapon systems and of course a troop contributor. All this is now at stake, and that has huge implications. And of course many people realize that this is the point. But we have a big challenge here, and we have to solve it. It's the challenge of economic and especially also of military autonomy. We cannot longer allow an American president to blackmail us, because that is exactly what's happening right now. We are too dependent on American LNG, cloud services, tech companies, tooling for chips manufacturing, also quite important, American military systems, and so on. So we must, from a military perspective and a security perspective, prepare for a situation where the US leaves Europe. And then the big question is, can we fill the gap and how to repair it? We did a lot of thinking about that, especially in my institute, and we came to the conclusion, yes, we can do that. It is doable. And Ukraine plays a hugely important role here. NATO should not be abolished, in my view, but it can also be an organization without America, believe it or not, because we need NATO for its command arrangements, its collective assets, like the AWACS aircraft, standardization agreements. We need that. Of course, you can transfer that to the European Union, but that leaves the UK out, and that is not advisable here. So we need it, but probably without the US. The EU will focus more and more on the development of capabilities, including the defense industrial base. Strategic autonomy in defense is possible, but again, this requires cooperation with Ukraine. This sounds a little bit technical, but American command and control systems, which are absolutely crucial for the defense of Europe, can be replaced by the Ukrainian Delta system. It sounds technical, it isn't, but the Delta system is a command and control system for the command of forces. You can do that. And it can also be integrated, we know that now, in the European satellite systems. You already can replace the Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlinks, by European system, Eutelsat, for example, OneWeb. That is already possible, and it is done already. We can replace American long-range weapon systems by looking at the drones, the long-range drones of Ukraine. It can be done. We don't need the American systems. And the size of the Ukrainian forces is more than enough to replace American forces. But there is, of course, one but. If Ukraine collapses, then we really have a big problem. So this is a prerequisite for European strategic autonomy in the military field. We have to support Ukraine here.
Rob, we'll come back, but I need to stop you there for the moment. Ian, are we moving towards, as Rob described it, a world of three big powers, three big power blocks, each with their buffer zones, with their, according each other, as it were, as a sphere of influence? And if that's the case, then What about Taiwan? Doesn't China get Taiwan under that arrangement? Or is there a Taiwan exception?
Paul, thank you. You could argue that, just as you did, Rob, that some of these structural issues, including the one that you're raising in your question, have actually existed for a long time. I mean, this is in a sense nothing new, but Trump and the whole experience of this has given history a shove. Certainly in Europe, sitting in Brussels, the concern about the United States shifting its strategic attention to Asia is nothing new. But there was, in a sense, a feeling that there was a luxury of time, that this could be a long-term sort of adjustment, because in fact, to do the kinds of things that you were talking about, Rob, takes a very long time. It's not quick. And that perhaps Europe was comfortable doing that because the United States was in this mounting confrontation with China in Asia. But of course, there was always a reality that something could go wrong, whether it was over Taiwan or over the South or in the South China Sea. Not in 5 years, but in 5 days, which would produce a crisis that would accelerate the shift of the United States from presence in European security to other things. I think this is roughly what we're seeing. By the way, I don't think Europe is completely, I don't want to say innocent in this, but Europe is also part of this spheres of influence thing. I mean, you could argue in a much more benign way that the whole enlargement process, the sort of European project in a bigger sense in Europe, in the Western Balkans, around the Black Sea, was also an attempt to extend the European model, if not European power, in your own space here. When you come to the United States and you look at what we're doing in our own hemisphere now, I think this is much less to do with somehow, the Trump administration discovering a hemispheric strategy than it is simply their obsession with foreign policy issues that touch on domestic public policy, whether it's borders or trade or other things. And a lot of that brings you into the hemisphere. I mean, I would just, maybe end the question by saying that one of the things that many Europeans expected was a sort of isolationist America from this administration. That's not what you've got at all. You've got, if anything, a hyper-unilateralist America, which has very different implications in terms of, in many respects, but including for the question that you asked.
Yeah. Hyper-unilateralist. It's an interesting thing. Obviously, Leslie, part of that unilateralism is about values. And when we talk about Munich, we're talking in particular about the speech that J.D. Vance gave, and which has since been, as it were, confirmed as being what they really think and not just one speech. Because when we read what they said to each other on Signal, they clearly do think that way about us Europeans. So my question to you is, does the West still exist as a community of values? Do we still share the same values? Liberal democracy, the rule of law, diversity, inclusion, if we think those are Western values, academic freedom, freedom of speech, or is it only freedom to say nasty things?
Well, I mean, there's so much in that question. First of all, I guess it's probably appropriate to remind ourselves that for many people, they've very long been out on the outside of the so-called West, both with respect to being on the receiving end of very powerful states, and especially a United States that did not respect their sovereignty, their democracy, and did not put their rights on an equal footing with those that existed or were aspirational within the United States and Europe in particular. Even much of the non-transatlantic West wasn't always given the same platform. And I think it's important to put that baseline out there always. Where are we now? I mean, I guess I would say a couple of things. One is, we cannot predict where we're going right now because we are in what I would say is a profound, radical moment of disruption. It is not simply more of the same America pivoting towards Asia and recognizing that China is the peer competitor. We are in a radical moment which certainly has those structural underpinnings, but is now defined by not in America, but an American administration that wants to not only disrupt America's closest alliances and partnerships, but wants to radically change the way that democracy in America functions, that wants to disrupt the role of America's elite liberal institutions, that wants to challenge scientific research, and that wants to upend and reconfigure America's executive branch. And these are all things that push at the boundaries and even get to the core of democracy, if you think of democracy being about, first and foremost, the rule of law.
Yeah.
So yes, America's democracy is being deeply challenged right now with respect to that question of rule of law and civil liberties. Most especially, I know many people think that the question of elections, which is clearly core to democracy, might be challenged. I'm not so sure about that. The second thing I would say is that, in the words of John Eikenberry's most recent book, the foundations of the West were really grounded in a commitment to the liberal international order, which was meant to make a world, to provide a world that would be safe for democracy. So you create multilateral institutions that have a set of principles that made it possible for Europe, in the aftermath of the Second World War, for the United States, for many other countries over time, to commit to restoring, reconstructing, rebuilding, and extending the democratic process. And if the three core tenets of the liberal international order were a commitment to democracy at home, a commitment to multilateral cooperation, and a commitment to an open trading order, those three things are clearly being deeply challenged today. So a world that was committed to, that would be safe for democracy, those commitments by the administration, and please, I would beg us all to differentiate between America, Americans, and the Trump administration. They are not the same. But there's no doubt that the fundamental advocate and proponent of that order, which was going to make democracy safe, as contested, as transformative, as disruptive as democracy has always been, that the lead proponent of that order is not, at the moment, an advocate of those three principles globally, or of those civil liberties, or of I would argue, it's certainly an open debate, of the rule of law and the things that have really made America successful historically.
So do you think it's possible then to construct a coalition of liberal democracies in Europe and around the world to preserve that system, to maintain as much as possible of the multilateral system in the absence, at least temporarily, of the United States? Or do you think that's a no-hoper because of the sheer power of the United States?
I would hate to foretell a future that we are all critically and vitally engaged in making. The big bet of the Trump administration right now is that you can have a transactional form of cooperation that is based on bilateral, interest-based cooperation, as opposed to anything that's based on a generalized set of principles, a diffuse rather than a specific reciprocity. My estimation, my assumption, and my expectation is that the big bet that you can have interest-based cooperation is deeply flawed, that interests do not fundamentally motivate people. Interests are necessary, but people are motivated by their passions and their values and their families and their communities. And if you do not ground cooperation in those values, obviously you have to look after interests, but if you don't, the whole thing collapses. And so I think the prospect right now, if the current administration continues on its current trajectory, and I think it's very far from clear that that will happen, the beginning of civic engagement, not only through the legal system, but now people on the streets, there is a beginning of what's been a slow and delayed pushback, but it is beginning. It's certainly coming from the rest of the world in delayed fashion. So I am by no means certain that we are on a a foretold path. But I think if that were to continue as it was, the prospect for a Western-based transatlantic cooperation is extremely bleak.
Stefan Mair, Europe, the European Union, Europe, our Europe, was founded on those very principles that Leslie so eloquently described. And all of our principles now are being challenged by the way our biggest ally and protector is behaving. What does that mean for us, for Europe? How much do we risk being infected by what's happening in the United States? And if you can think a bit wider, as Leslie did in her first remarks, what does it mean for the rest of the world, which has come to be known by the moniker of the Global South, although I think it's probably a misnomer.
Let me start with your first question, because I think we are already infected. When you look at the rise of illiberal democracies in the European Union, also the strength of right-wing populist forces in the European Union, we are affected. I'm still quite confident that it wouldn't go that far as in the United States, but we have certainly to deal with this issue. On your second question, I think it's quite important that we diversify our relationships, especially to the countries of the Global South. Our perception of the countries of the Global South has quite changed in the past 3 years. For long, we mainly saw them as recipients of development and humanitarian aid, as countries where we sent peacekeeping forces or we had to fight terrorists. Now we see them increasingly as potential partners to avoid another bipolar Cold War and to build a coalition in which we can agree on the preservation of certain basic rules. For me, it's not a coalition of liberal democracies. I think we are, in the meantime, too few really to preserve then a global order. Now we have to reach out to other countries, especially in the Global South, win them over as partners, make them quite attractive and comprehensive partnership offers, countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, many others. And I hope that those might form a coalition together with us to preserve, as I said, a basic set of rules very much enshrined in the UN Charter.
But if you're sitting in the Global South, there must be a temptation yourself to be very transactional, because Russia's trying to charm you and offering you security for minerals types of deals. China is offering you infrastructure, often based on onerous loans, but and trade and at a market. So, you know, when the European Union comes to see you, first of all, they come with long questionnaires about your human rights record, your record on diversity, and so on. Are we pricing ourselves out of the market in that part of the world?
I think we are just changing our mind on that. You are right. So you're perfectly right. So that the European offer was not that attractive, and that we are competing with other partners or other countries who make perhaps more attractive offers. On the other hand, I think we can refer to having been a reliable partner for many of these countries for decades. We started development cooperation in the early 60s and have maintained it for quite a long time. Yeah. And we can build on this relationship. We have to broaden it and to include other areas. But I think we can make an attractive offer at the end as well.
To the whole of the Global South, or specifically to Africa, which is our geographical time zone, hinterland, historical partner, perhaps?
Yeah, I think Africa certainly will play a role. But when you look at the power base of many African countries, you hardly find anyone which might be in a position really to shape the global order together with Europe. Yeah. South Africa perhaps is one of those. Nigeria is in a quite difficult situation. So I'm more looking to the Indias and the Brazils and Indonesias. Yeah. But Africa, I think, as a whole, will be quite important to shape our relationship in the global context.
I want to go back to Rob. You said that we still need the NATO structures and they're still useful, and you explained why. NATO without America, what does that look like? I mean, the core thing about NATO is that it is the transatlantic link, and that's embodied, personified by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who since the dawn has always been an American four-star general. Can we, and that person embodies not only the kind of transatlantic conventional link, but also the transatlantic nuclear link. Can we continue to have a NATO with a European supreme commander? Will Europeans obey the orders of a European supreme commander? How do we manage that?
Good question. Without America, not. So we have to have a completely new NATO. Use NATO for its procedures, standardization, objectives, etc., but without America. There is already a discussion about troop withdrawals from the US, minus 20%, something like that, but also the withdrawal of SACEUR. So it will become less American. You simply cannot trust the American president, who is the commander-in-chief of the American armed forces, to fulfill his obligations towards Europe, including his extended deterrence obligation. Yep. That's a big problem. So we have to come up with new ideas. There is a discussion in your country, Stefan, on a cooperation in the nuclear field with the French or with the Brits. The Brits is more difficult than with the French, but that is a tactical reason, because the French have part of their nuclear arsenal in standoff weaponry for aircraft, and the UK doesn't have that. So it's nuclear sharing is more easier with the French. But we have to think about things like that, and we have to do it fast, really. We have to restructure our armed forces. I mentioned a couple of things we can do, because if America withdraws from NATO, it leaves big holes in our defenses, but we can do that, and we can do that relatively easy and fast. So there is a big discussion going on in NATO about more tanks, more artillery pieces. That is not necessary right now. Yeah. Look how the Ukrainians organize their defenses. This is drone defenses. This is cheap. We can do that. Okay, we have to produce tanks, but that is something what we can do over the years. But we can do this relatively quickly. But it requires a completely new way of thinking about defense of Europe, about collective defense, about nuclear deterrence, but we can do it.
I mean, we can't really use the European Union, it seems to me, because inside the European Union we have neutral countries, we have a couple of countries that are pro-Putin, we don't have the UK, we don't have Norway, yeah, and we don't have Turkey.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to have, in my view, also a nuclear or a new kind of Security Council in Europe. Mm-hmm. So we have this Weimar triangle, which, yeah, is extremely interesting. That is France, Poland, and Germany, but you should include the UK in this, and it is already happening. Now, if you do that, then you have already a nucleus of a European Security Council.
Yeah, I wrote in my Guardian column a couple of weeks ago that this new European Security Council is already emerging in practice.
It's already there.
Even, yeah, though it doesn't exist in theory.
Yeah, we don't call it like that, but it's already there.
Ian, you've followed these things for a long time. Are you ready to say the requiem over NATO and the transatlantic link, or do you think there's still hope that it can be saved?
No, well, look, I'm optimistic by nature, and you know, I'm not sure if that comes from living in Brussels or not, but look, also, you know, I'm a rather internationalist, Atlanticist, American resident of Brussels, so in some ways I'm the wrong person to ask. Yeah. But look, we're going to have midterm elections in the United States in less than 2 years. Yeah. And we're talking about the situation we face, and I don't want to reduce the implications of what we're seeing. They're terrible. But are they irreversible? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Yeah. And I would share the view that NATO remains the cornerstone for building whatever it's going to be in the future, whether it's with the United States, without the United States. I totally agree it's likely less United States. Yeah. I mean, people talk about a coalition of the willing. Well, you have a coalition of the willing. It's called NATO. Yeah. And so I can imagine a future in which right across the spectrum of what's necessary from nuclear deterrence to crisis management, that you have a NATO that is more European, that remains vibrant, where the United States, maybe in 4 years' time you find comes back in a very, very active way. Why not? I would just add one other point about this, which is, two things really. One is that if Europe is going to spend more and do more, which I'm sure is going to happen, what do you count? What do you count? Whether you're talking about 5% or 4% or 3.5%, I think there's going to be a much more interesting discussion about what is in that. Yeah. What do you count? Is it about just buying stuff, or is it about military mobility and infrastructure and intelligence collect, all that kind of stuff? Cybersecurity, all of those things which are actually contributions, counterterrorism.
And our Spanish friends would say
exactly.
Migration.
All of these things. And there will be different views, I'm sure, in Europe about that. The other point is a little more subtle, but in some ways more difficult. It's one thing to buy things and create structures. It's quite another to change strategic culture.
Yeah.
And, that varies, I think you would agree, widely across Europe.
Yeah.
Will societies be willing to use force in the way that the United States, it's imagined, would use force?
Well, you've teed me up, you've lined me up to come back to Stefan, which is the country that is having its second Zeitenwende shock now. The first Zeitenwende shock was the loss of cheap Russian gas in the Russian market, and the weakening of the Chinese market and so on. The second Zeitenwende shock, I think, of equal magnitude is the loss of the United States, at least temporarily. Your view, is it temporary, or do we have to consider that it's more permanent? And is Germany, to answer Ian's question, is Germany going to be ready now to fight if necessary?
It might be temporary, and it might be that America is back after 4 years, but it might disappear after another 8 years. So that's a challenge, I think, for Europe. The reliability is gone, and that's the reason why we have to try to guarantee our own security. And as I said, it's not irreversible, but when we have a reverse, then it might be reversed again. So that's the challenge we have, certainly. And I see a strong determination in Germany, really, to draw the right lessons out of this. We haven't had a second Zeitenwende speech so far. We had only one sentence made by Friedrich Merz on election night, that Germany has to become independent from the United States. Quite a statement for somebody who is transatlanticist.
I fell off my chair.
And I don't expect a speech on that. When you look at the small paragraph on transatlantic relations in the coalition treaty, it's very mild on this. But I think the lessons are very clear. We have now reformed the debt brake to a degree which allows us to spend by far more than 2% on defense, and we will certainly do so. And we have to reach out to the other Europeans. This is, I think, one of the great failures of the past coalition, that we have done enough really to form a really strong European Union and to revitalize it again.
So revitalizing the European Union, even if the defense stuff has to be done, as we've agreed, outside of the European Union structures. That's a big program. What about young Germans? Will young Germans sign up to serve in the Bundeswehr? Will you have, because the Bundeswehr has been very much a sort of a cardboard army for a long time, since the end of the Cold War, really. Will you get back the strategic culture that maybe you had during the Cold War, but now that once the border moved comfortably to the east and Germany was comfortably surrounded by allies and NATO allies and EU partners, that was the end of war. That was finished, over. We could now go on do business. Is it possible to rewind that in German mentality?
Difficult to say. I'm of a generation that still had to do the compulsory military service and was quite happy that my sons didn't have to do it. But when you talk to them, I say, okay, as soon as there is a legislation expecting me to do this, I will do this. I don't know whether this really counts as a part of a strategic culture. I have doubts how strong the strategic culture was in Germany during the Cold War, but I think we certainly also see a change in public opinion, in how the people see their own security and what they are willing to contribute to this. So there is a change, but not a fundamental one, but a slow one, and hopefully in the right direction.
Leslie, back to you. You planted a flag about the rest of the world and the way the West was perceived, Western double standards were perceived in the rest of the world. So if we look at what's left at the post-World War II order, how does it look now to the rest of the world, to those who are not going through this psychodrama of the loss of mummy?
Well, I mean, I'll respond very humbly because I can see as I look at the audience that there are many people who are physically, daily located in the rest of the world, so it'd be very presumptuous. But, you know, from what I hear, it doesn't look very good, and it hasn't looked very good for quite some time, and so this is not new. Europe, as we know, looks insular. The Indians always say, when Europe starts caring about the rest of the world, we'll start caring about Europe's war. We have wars everywhere. This is, you know, going back to, I guess, the words that were so frequently articulated at the Raisina dialogue in the year after in the weeks, months, and year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, America and Europe's response to the pandemic didn't articulate as much material investment and care as it should have for Global South countries, haven't responded to the debt question very effectively. I mean, everybody here knows the challenges. I guess I do want to come back to this question about Europe's security in NATO, though. And my, you know, a couple of things. One is, I think it's dead obvious to everybody that Europe is doing more and needs to do a whole lot more to invest in its security defense cooperatively, and that it should have done it a long time ago, but maybe it's heading in the right direction, yes. But I think I would add to that. One is, we have to think kind of what is the context going to be? Are we going to be on a trajectory where the US actually succeeds in its effort to reset its relationship with Russia? If that happens, then, you know, the entire conversation about NATO, it's not just about whether the United States is in or out, it's what is the rest of the sphere look like if the United States and Russia are in it together? Yeah. Ooh, wow, that is different, right? A second question that we have to ask is about China. Where is Europe going to be on China? And what pressure is the US going to put on Europe with respect to China? These are very, you know, we have inklings. We obviously don't have the answer. And is Europe going to hold together on the question of China? Is it going to hold together if Trump moves forward to try? I mean, I'm very skeptical about whether he will be successful on this, deeply skeptical, but we know he is trying. And I guess the third thing I would say is it is very short-sighted in my view. It would be a fundamental and tragic mistake not to find the parts of America, of which there are many, and invest in keeping them close, tight, near and dear to the parts of Europe that we want to keep near and dear. We know that there is a lot going on in Europe that probably many people in this room don't aspire to be part of. And there's certainly a lot going on in America that I reject and that, quite frankly, my family reject, my communities reject, my professional networks reject. There is a huge amount to play for in the United States of America. Let's not just sort of, you know, sell it down the river because we have one man who admittedly was elected by a very large number of Americans. But let's not sell it down the river.
Give us an idea of how you would do that. I mean,
invest in university partnerships, travel to the United States, invest in business cooperation, invest in the state level exchange with governors, mayors, all the things that people like on the climate question, John Kerry and others tried to do in the first Trump administration. Yeah. Everybody here, I would hazard a guess, is deeply engaged with multiple parts of the United States of America. It's a phenomenally large country. It's just too short-sighted. It's not even doable to talk about, you know, Europe and the United States separating. It's really, really overly simplistic. So I think that while Europe undoubtedly needs to invest, and that is not new, it has got to play the medium-term game when it comes to the United States of America.
Rob, I saw you shaking your head.
No, I
Was
think
that in agreement or in disagreement?
in disagreement. Of course,
Great, we like disagreement.
of course, I want to go back to normal with
I
the
didn't
US.
say go back to normal.
Absolutely. I love the country. Many friends are American. I've been there hundreds of times. But that's not the case. You cannot plan for a strategy of hope. I really hope that this will be the case, but you have to have a plan B. That's what you should do. You have to have an economic plan B and a military plan B, if you want it or not. Because this is what the situation is right now. You cannot rely on Trump anymore. Trust is gone. Trust is a precious commodity in international politics. If it's gone, you have to have a plan B. That's what it is. So it's a dangerous strategy, because if you say, well, let's hope that things get back to normal, then you do nothing. And we have a reputation of doing nothing in this part of the world. So it's highly dangerous. And this is, maybe you don't have a choice in the UK because you are out of the European Union. And that's also a big problem, because your country is more or less isolated in this game. So you have a problem. We have to move forward in the European Union, and we have to have very, very close ties with the UK, especially in the field of security issues. So my guess is Plan B.
Well, you don't have to convince me. You're talking to a Remainer who has taken French citizenship. But yes, of course, we put ourselves out of the game, and perhaps this blow-up with Trump is actually pushing us back into the game in a constructive way, which many of us had hoped for, but had not thought was likely for quite a while. Leslie, come back
I
in.
want to say, the UK is a perfect example of why you've got to play the medium-term game. What is the UK trying to do right now? Reset its relationship with Europe.
Yes.
You could have said, oh, fine, Brexit, it's over, we're done with the UK, but instead, actually, what we're seeing right now is an attempt to invest. The United States is going to change too. There's no, absolutely, it would be foolish, short-sighted to engage in a strategy of complacency and sitting and waiting out the Trump administration. We could be on the edge of a precipice of a phenomenally dark period in the United States of America. It is completely up for grabs. So my case, my argument is not, no, it is don't be binary. A, stay in it to win it with the parts of the United States that can make a positive difference, and frankly, are continuing to do so with Europe. But plan obviously for something that could be much, much worse than it already is.
We're coming to final words. The other precipice on the edge of which we stand, if that's grammatically right, is Ukraine, as Rob said initially. If we lose Ukraine, Europe is in a much, much worse and more dangerous situation. And if the United States and Russia achieve rapprochement, it could be over the interests of Ukraine. So how do we sustain Ukraine against a potential US-Russian carve-up? Ian, do you want to take that? And then I'll ask each of you very quickly.
It's a hugely difficult question, and I know there are people in the audience who live this problem every day. I'm looking at one in particular, but I have to say, it's easier, not easy, but easier to imagine a kind of dealing with a ceasefire based on some territorial arrangement than it is to imagine what it is that comes after that could actually be durable, that would be stable for Europe. And I find it very odd to have all of these conversations going on in Europe about coalitions that could be put in place to, well, what? Monitor, surveil, guarantee, deter. What is it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows what the scale would be. I don't think it's necessarily so that 4 years from now you won't have an America that sort of comes back in with more interest in this. Will Europe be paying the bulk of the cost for this? No question about it.
Rob,
but
30 seconds each. 30 seconds each.
No, we have to invest in our defense industrial base and the defense industrial base of Ukraine. I don't believe in all kind of peacekeeping operations, stabilization for operations, deterrence forces, because there's lack of forces. We simply cannot do that. So then you need an exit strategy if you put too few troops in Ukraine. So there's a big problem here. And if we lose Ukraine, we have a huge problem.
Stefan?
I think probably we will have Ukraine diminished by some of the territories now occupied by Russia. And we as Europeans have to make sure that the rest of Ukraine is still a state which can operate and be part of Europe. And that means that we have to invest still in Ukraine's defense quite a lot, but also in economic rehabilitation at a certain point.
And in accelerating its integration into the European Union.
Yes.
Well, folks, thank you. We've had a great panel, and I want to ask you in a second to join me in congratulating our panel on having covered so much ground in 50 minutes. But before I do, let me tell you why you should stay in this room after we're gone, and that is that the next up is a panel on Germany after the elections, and are we facing another turning point for Europe?
You're not going to have questions?
I'm terribly sorry. I was told that we couldn't take questions from the floor, but if you wish to ask a question, sir, we have 51 seconds in which to answer it.
Thank you very much.
And say who you are.
I believe we need plan C, not only plan B. Because you were all discussing the security of Europe, mainly in terms of Trump, Putin, Russia, etc. You forgot to deal with or you missed, or perhaps intentionally, where is the global south? You think that security in Europe depends only on America and Russia? It depends also on the Mediterranean countries, south and east. How can you talk about the security in Europe without talking about the security in the Mediterranean? And here we come. Can you decide for us? I don't think that the new world will allow you to decide for the third world or for the global south. You are mistaken. You spent 50 minutes, not a single word about the south, about the other countries neighboring the European countries, even you.
Thank
You should
Thank
have
you, sir.
talked about this thing.
Thank you very much.
About
Second
about
to
the
respond.
rest.
Sorry, sir,
One
you
thing.
came 10 minutes late. We spent actually the first 10 minutes, 15 minutes on the Global South.
Why didn't you wait for me until
We get 1 second.
Thank you. In case anybody missed it, that was Amrus. Thank you very much for your comment. We did talk about the Global South, but
you're right.
indeed,
But you're right.
not enough, and
general, you're
there
right.
is much more to say. With that, I ask you to welcome the next panel and thank my panel.